Okay. Um, as I start recording this video, we're the 14th of April 2023, and I intend to provide not a lecture, but an introspective introspection on psychoanalysis. I've never studied psychoanalysis theoretically. I've watched a couple of lectures over the past few weeks, but I haven't read many books. I've read Nietzsche. Maybe that's enough. And I just want to use my own document to illustrate my way of thinking. So that's the totality of a human society, which exists within nature, namely the physical world, and the progression goes from the world soul, the soul which individualizes itself, develops, and eventually the transition. I've already talked about this document many times, but I will again. This document illustrates the totality of the categories, which are simplifications in a way of what a society is, and all of this is the soul in a way, the categories which enable to speak about the human soul, namely sociobiology, anthropology, demographics, sexual differences, evolutionary psychology, the individual soul, the personality of each individual. Here we have psychoanalysis and psychiatry, self-consciousness, psychology in a more here we would have basic sociobiological psychology, and here it's more refined imagination. It's more spiritual in a way. Imagination, memory, introspection, language, thought, and IQ, and the development of the exteriorization of intelligence through will. That's the passage, that's the growing up of the soul, which becomes mind in a way, and all these categories are the various institutions that humans bring forth to interact together. So here these are the natural determinations of man, and here the more spiritual ones, namely life within society, interacting with others, creating a sustainable human group based on laws. So here the determination is natural, biological, and here it's more spiritual in a way, but there is a continuum. It's distinct, but nonetheless in a continuity. And my way of thinking is simply to envision the totality, and since I intend to talk about psychoanalysis, it cannot be distinguished from all the other moments of the soul, male and female differences, the biological, sociobiological instincts of man. Here I will pick up a book, because every time that new knowledge is being discovered or actualized or brought forth, it sheds a new light onto the totality in a way. So here's evolutionary psychology, the god of light, Apollo, the Greek god of light. So yeah, the natural determinations, the biological determinations of man are important. The personality, the physiognomy, the temper, the personal development of the individual psyche is important as well. And I will talk about partly my personal case, because I am my own patient in a way. And yeah, and here the growing up of the soul towards psychological integration and the ability to communicate with others through language, a shared means of exchanging ideas, feelings, experiences, etc., intelligence, will, etc. And every determination is connected to all the others, but here, since I intend to talk specifically about psychoanalysis, the individual psyche the inner conflict of the individuals, they are being reflected. If it's sufficiently numerous in a way, that's the determination of measure, they will be reflected onto the whole of society, and it's a reciprocal interaction, namely a change of legislation, a change of political ideology, economic structure, culture or morality, or the relationship within the family unit can have, and indeed has, an effect upon the individual soul, because here it's predominantly biological and natural, but it's also partly cultural, so everything is interconnected. That's Wechselwirkung, reciprocal determination. But broken families, for instance, they tend to produce, not necessarily, but significantly, in a significant proportion, they tend to produce unbalanced individuals. There is partly a genetic aspect, but also a cultural aspect. Someone who's had an unbalanced or difficult upbringing has usually stronger likelihood of suffering from personal problems, which then will be made manifest in difficulty in relationship with others, economic difficulty, maybe with crime, etc., etc. That's why someone like Stefan Molyneux advocates peaceful parenting. It may not be sufficient, but certainly is an important condition for the production of healthy, psychologically healthy and balanced human beings. So I intend to talk about psychoanalysis, but I will make comments. The connections with economics, finance, politics, budget, sociology, communication as well, morality, etc., etc. I am not giving a lecture. I'm simply sharing the result of personal introspection, and also I intend to comment a video which is available on YouTube, Introduction to Psychoanalysis by Otto Kernberg. So I used this video that I watched and I took notes to have a formal presentation of psychoanalysis, and I mixed this with my personal experience and what I vaguely knew, and I will comment, yeah. So I will present my document. That's how I envision this. It might partly change, of course, because psychoanalysis is a process, I guess. But at this moment in time, this is how I envision. So here's the... Make Psychoanalysis Great Again, a study of the German psyche. Oh, is that? It will be partly comical. Sometimes the laughter is a means to alleviate. Yeah. So I have put illustration, how I envision. Here I will use my other document. Now that I've produced documents and that I've made them public over and over many videos, I will use them to work in a way. I'm a singular individual. Every human being has psychoanalytical, if not problems, at least tendencies, one might say. Every individual has a soul and obeys specific patterns. In case, here, let us imagine the universal are psychological problems, the various particular psychoanalytical problems. There is a borderline personality disorder, narcissism, antisocial behavior, fear of abandonment, obsessive romantic relation, etc., etc. I have a list. I'm not sure it's complete, but yeah. And here I'm a singular individual, so it's kind of, they are kind of inversely correlated. Namely, the singular contains within himself the particular and the universal, but also the singular, it works for every human, but actually for every object, contains many more determinations that would be in orange, green and blue. It's a totality, fully determined. The particular contains less determinations, characteristics, features, properties, but it applies to a broader range of individuals. So there's an inverse quantitative relationship that's actually logical. A singular human being has more determinations, characteristic features than the particular and the universal, so it's more concrete, it's more rich in a way, but it applies only to one individual, whereas the particular has less characteristic, but it applies to a broader range, and the universal has even less characteristic property features, but it applies to an even broader range. So yeah, here I will talk about my singular case with my own psychoanalytical problems. A lot of humans have psychoanalytical problems. I will talk about my own, but I will try to extract the particular and the universal. So there will be the reverse movement. Comments about the theoretical aspect of psychoanalysis and about my personal case. So here I will switch the table and show how I envision this. It's a process, but this is my personal view of psychoanalysis, which might shed some light. Where are you, Apollo? Shed some light on psychoanalysis. Yeah, I will briefly comment. Yeah, there is classical. Here, I'm not an expert in psychoanalysis, but I knew enough. There is a three-part aspect, a trinity aspect of the personality. Here, that's the view of Freud: the id, the ego, and the superego. That would be the subconscious or the unconscious, the moral duty in a way, the social self in a sense of having to restrict oneself for the sake of living in a social life. And here that would be the normal average consciousness. Here I really simplify: subconscious primitive tendencies, superego, the moral obligation, and the self, the normal personality. And my view, I don't need to study psychoanalysis thoroughly to understand. In my view, my own id would be Nietzsche, my ego would be Kant, and my superego would be Hegel. But actually, all the categories, they can be more or less switched in a sense that sometimes Hegel is my normal self and my superego is Kant, because Hegel can be the superego in terms of the moral. Moral here doesn't mean morality in the sense of agent, the standards, the requirement, which put a lot of pressure to perform in terms of intellectual achievement, excellence, etc., etc. So that's what the superego does. The superego can be very critical. It's not hearing voices, but simply it's an inner mode of consciousness, in a way, which is very demanding because it requires either moral purity and ethical behavior or achievement. So it can be very demanding. So most of the time my superego is Hegel, because expectation from intellectual excellence and scientific excellence and a very high standard. But other times my superego is Kant, because Kant is the moral agent. Here Kant usually would be the moral superego, the categorical imperative. You have to do your duty, you have to be altruistic. That's not what Kant says, but basically that's what it means. And then sometimes Nietzsche can be the superego, because Nietzsche is kind of the will to power, etc. But Kant, yeah, I make a joke. For me, Kant is like the voice of sanity between the two insane German philosophers, Hegel on one side, Nietzsche on the other, and I'm stuck in the middle with Kant. And here I use examples which have been very enlightening for me. Eminem and Lady Gaga, they are not only artistic geniuses, but I know that they are the embodiment, the masculine and feminine embodiment of God in the modern pop culture industry. It's not a random assertion. I'm not saying that they are necessarily the best, although they are, but there are some artists who might be slightly better on some aspect, but actually these are the best in modern pop culture. As individuals, then there are groups or bands, but as individuals they are the best. But because they are excellent at what they do, their music is great, their artistic talent is exceptional, but they are also divine and made in the image of God more than most others, one might say, most other humans and all other artists in the music industry, because they are some sort of a free part personality. And for Eminem, the ego would be Marshall Mathers. I'm just Marshall Mathers. I don't know why all the fuss about me. I'm just a regular guy, etc., etc. Eminem would be the superego in the sense that it's also a grandiose, a great image of himself that Marshall Mathers created, and then he performed and he succeeded and he achieved and still does great artistic production. So it creates a very high expectation here that would not necessarily be in terms of morality, although it partly is, because Slim Shady and Eminem sometimes they are a little bit in a conflict around what is controversial, what is acceptable, etc. But it creates very high expectations in terms of production. Eminem, Marshall Mathers talks about this in a lot of his songs. The expectations, they are very high because he's Eminem. So yeah, he has created for himself very high standards, which can be difficult to. But most of the time he surpasses himself. He's still great after more than 25 years or more of career. Lady Gaga, she says this, Stephanie says this in some interviews, that she created unconsciously and then maybe consciously the character Lady Gaga to express an aspect of her personality, and Mother Monster, that's in one of her songs, Born This Way, but however she called it, the darker aspect, the slim shady aspect of Lady Gaga. It's not really like Eminem because she's a female and they are different in terms of personality, but also she has this free type personality. There is Lady Gaga, that would be the artistic genius with all her aspects, the comical, the romantic, sometimes the dark and twisted aspect. Stephanie, that's just an ordinary woman with her own problems that she's trying to overcome through artistic expression, but she's a very intelligent and extremely talented human being and a great person. And Mother Monster, or however she calls this, that's the darker aspect, which is expressed in the song of Lady Gaga. So the three aspects, they are three in one, in a way. That's why that's the image of God. Yeah, and here that's my case. In terms of affiliation to countries, in a way, sometimes my superego, that would be the German self, the authority figure, the German toughness, one might say, but actually my superego is also the United States, not the modern United States of America. Sometimes the US, they would be in the the category, but the superego of the excellence, the achievements that this country has produced and still does. So when the US, I classify in superego to 19th century United States, which is probably the fastest, most impressive rise of any nation ever over the course of 250 years. The United States, I mean, what would become the United States, were a British colony which became the world's greatest superpower in a very short amount of time, historically, with exceptional achievements politically, economically, militarily, culturally, in terms of innovation, etc., etc., while remaining true to a creed of liberty and individual freedom, etc. So, in this sense, the US, they are often my superego, not the modern US, but the classical achievements. Germany, sometimes it's my superego, and France, I classify this I'm not sure that the French belong there. If they do, I'm not sure that they would find this pleasant, or maybe they would, I don't know. Nietzsche, he loved sometimes the French more than the Germans, but yeah. But because France, in the European family, they are the Germans. How I envision this from my perspective, they are the Germans. They are, when they are in the superego mode, they are kind of the rulers. Here it's not a joke, because a little bit of anthropological history, most Western European countries, it includes the colonies by the Anglo-Saxon, they have been historically and still sometimes predominantly populated by Germanic people. France was founded by a Germanic tribe. The Anglo-Saxons are a Germanic people. Scandinavian countries are Germanic people. Germany is Germanic. There are Germanic peoples, or were in northern Italy, some parts of Spain, Eastern Europe, etc. Yeah, and the Anglo-Saxon, I classify here because the English, sometimes they're also the superego in terms, not the modern English, but like the US, like actually most European countries, the English of the 19th century, the 18th, the 17th century even, the classical English, they kind of belong in a way with the US because, in this case, because sometimes it's the superego in terms of achievement, and sometimes it's in terms of morality. The Puritans, they were a pure, very moral, very ethical, very pious, very religious people with refined customs in terms of moral purity. So this is what made the US great, partly, and what made England great in the 19th century and in the previous centuries. So in this sense, the English, they are the Germans, the French, and the Anglo-Saxons. That's my view of the European family. Yeah, and here it can include as well the Canadians, New Zealand, etc. etc. Yeah. In terms of politics, socialism would be the id, because socialism, I've understood this, it's kind of a primitive, sometimes regressive view that the id is some sort of the subconscious and the need for these are kind of the primitive impulses of man, not completely developed. So my view of socialism is kind of negative, because I'm a product of socialism. So it's kind of the past that I'm trying to overcome or to escape from, actually to overcome by maturing and becoming more a libertarian. Here that would be, libertarianism would be the political philosophy of grown-up individuals. Socialism, in my view, this is politics for children, because everything has to be free, available in abundance. Restrictions are considered to be limiting and to be bad. That's really the child. Here, that's the psychoanalytical view. That's really the child with the mother who feeds the child, who breastfeeds the child, and the child wants to satisfy all his needs and desires. And the superego, that's part of the psychoanalytical theory, that's the father who separates the child from the mother, and who says, not directly, but who becomes a rival in a sense. So socialism is the ideology of there is abundance, and there is no need to work, there is no need to be thrifty, there is no need to manage resources rationally and with scarcity. Everything is abundant. That's the ideal, but actually it's kind of regressive, because this is how most children who have the opportunity and the chance to have parents, or at least people who take care of them, how they are treated when they are treated well. Everything is given to them, and when you grow up, you have to acquire your own resources. So, and nationalism, if Germany is in the center, nationalism is an attempt to reconcile both sides in a way. Yeah, but sometimes nationalism can be the superego. That's just a way of illustrating. Yeah, the id, the subconscious, the primitive impulses, that would be chaos. Order is that which emerges out of chaos. It's distinction, organization, hierarchy, structure. These are mythological views. The Greeks, in their mythology, there was the primordial chaos, and then the titans, the giants, the gods, the demigods, etc. The cosmogony of the Greeks, or any people, but the Greek cosmogony, the cosmogenesis expressed through mythological figures, is an attempt to illustrate the cosmic genesis in a way. And order is that which is supposed to emerge out of the primordial chaos through an act of the will, and an act of the intelligence. And in the middle, I will not show, maybe I will show my sweatshirt. Yeah. The ego, precisely, that's the principle of individuation, which is in the middle, trying to find balance between two opposing tendencies. Yeah. And here, hedonism that I associate with France and with socialism, and partly with Nietzsche, infantile, that's precisely the primordial unity, there's not yet separation, individuation, etc. So it's kind of partly reassuring at first, but when you grow up, it's kind of regressive. These are the views of the id, translated in terms of psychology, but also partly politics. So the socialists, they think that they are progressive, but actually it's kind of regressive. And here we would have Stoicism, to renounce sensuous satisfaction for the sake of a rational outlook, exert the will, temperance, etc. Maturity and progressive. But it can also be thought that because the categories, sometimes they can be switched in the sense that there are intelligent, relevant criticisms, socialist critiques of capitalism or libertarianism, which accuse precisely of bringing economic chaos and being kind of infantile in the infinite will to accumulate, the greedy capitalist. Of course, this exists, and capitalism is not just the psychological transposition into economics of greed, but actually the socialists here, I have to give them credit, they are really financiers and capitalists who really project immaturity, so infantile aspects, onto the economy. They want to accumulate. It's unhealthy in a way. If it's not the case of all wealthy people, all billionaires, all rich, successful entrepreneurs. Of course not. There are those who do this as a means, precisely as a means to achieve, to perform, to innovate, who are psychologically balanced. But there are, here the left is partly right, among the class of the really wealthy, there are people who are psychologically and psychoanalytically unbalanced. Health means kind of balance, they are unbalanced, and it can turn into an infantile will to accumulate to ever more. So here the criticism of the left, it's partly correct. So it's not rigid, but actually the three, they kind of complement one another, and the personality of each human, depending on the complexity and the depth and the wealth, one might say, is more or less structured with kind of this category. Of course here, France, Germany, and the Anglo-Saxon countries, it's really my case as a European, an anthropological European, but then of course an Asian person, an African person, a Middle Eastern person would see things differently, but every person who lives in a regional, cultural, anthropological area probably has certain views, and here I cannot mix psychology with anthropology, other than my particular case of being a European, an anthropological European. But an Asian person, maybe the biases, sometimes they are prejudices and truly biased, that's truly bigotry sometimes, but sometimes it's actually accurate. And here, the French, well, there's a lot to say about the French, but in my view, they are kind of the country of hedonism, the French. Not all of them, but symbolically the French, it's the country of bien vivre, bon vivre, l'art de vivre. So for the French, to live well means wine, pleasures of food, sex. Whereas for the Anglo-Saxons, traditionally, not in modernity, but traditionally, there's some sort of a disdain for the sensuous pleasure, and they are more dedicated, they are more intimate, they are more virtuous, Puritan, etc., etc. Puritanism, that would be the superego. In France, there are individuals who are puritanical in their behavior without being religiously puritanical. Of course, like there are hedonistic, little bit regressive people in the Anglo-Saxon countries, especially in the modern world. But traditionally, the Anglo-Saxons, at least how I envisioned, as I envision them, they are really puritanical, whereas the French and the southern countries of Europe, the Spaniards, the Italians, they are more sensuous. Yeah. And the Germans, they are here on the side of the Anglo-Saxon, they are really traditionally were very disciplined. Of course, it's a little bit caricatural because, but at least the aristocracy in France historically has been kind of decadent for many centuries, whereas the German aristocracy has been militaristic, and the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy has been bent on commerce and trade and productivity, etc. I simplify, but yeah. And my view, translated in the realm of politics, my view of sanity and balance, this is the trinity here. It's not the trinity of id, ego, superego, it's a trinity within the ego of a healthy, balanced, mature, grown-up, intelligent, realized, in a sense of self-development trinity. Ron Paul, Charles Murray, Thomas Sowell. For me, they represent. Here we have a picture of Thomas Jefferson, who is kind of they are the intellectual heirs of Jefferson. They have preserved the tradition, the Jeffersonian and the classical American tradition. And for me, they represent sanity. Within the ego, that's my moral and political compass, a society where men like these embody the ideal. I'm not saying that they are perfect on an individual level, and it's not important, but their career and their achievements and their life is a testimony to the success of the classical American ideal, where people of different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, but who share a similar set of ideas, are capable of rationally discussing together while promoting the best interest of society in an individualist, in a good sense, manner. This is really my political compass. This is my view of the US as it ought to be, as it still partly is. These people, they are healthy psychologically. Maybe they have their own psychological problems on an individual level, and honestly I'm not interested, but they represent the ideal of a grown-up society where intelligent, rational debate can transcend other distinctions. And they represent a humanist ideal, from my perspective, of a human accomplishment. That's the title of a book by Charles Murray, but here I'm talking about the accomplishment of a society which succeeds in promoting intelligence, discipline, rationality, individualism, but openness to collaboration and cooperation with everyone, and a universalist set of ethics which can be applied to all. That's my view. And life, liberty, and love, these are for me the three most important, one might say, I don't know how to qualify this, ideas, I don't know, but life, it's kind of good, but it has precisely this negative tendency as well, because life is primordial, it's biological, it's life is the way it is in a way with sometimes the here that would be nature in the realm of the encyclopedic view, nature with its tendencies, one might say. Life is assertion, there is libido and aggression. This is precisely the primordial instincts that the id refers to in psychoanalytical theory. Liberty, it's an ideal, but it's also the individual self in a way. But that's more of an ideal. But and they represent liberty realized, or the success, but also the aim in a way of realizing liberty in a society. Not these three men as individuals, although they do, but the idea that they embody what they represent, and love, of course. And here they can be kind of inverted. The love of liberty, the love of life, the life of liberty, and the liberty of love, the freedom of love. So that's how I envision the free aspect. But here, that's my Hegelian view. I know that each aspect kind of contains the other, because sometimes a very strict superego, a very demanding morally, can partly be a means of it can be excessive, so they are kind of moving. But that's how I envision psychoanalysis with my own categories, one might say. And I know I have the certainty, Eminem, Marshall Mathers, and Stephanie, but especially Eminem, because here that's more the masculine aspect, he really is the greatest, and the reason is Slim Shady, Marshall, and Eminem, these are really three aspects, and they kind of complement one another. And here, it can be sometimes negative, but actually there are positives as well, because it's it goes in the direction of life. And Slim Shady, well, that's the artistic way that Marshall Mathers found to express inner conflicts and instincts that all humans have, but he succeeded in expressing and transcending this artistically. And Slim Shady, well, it can be a little bit excessive, but he succeeded in turning the dark aspect into thought-provoking or sometimes comical. So Eminem is a lyrical genius, but he's also a great human being. He has gone through really tough times, but he has succeeded in transcending the darker aspect of human nature through an artistic expression. And Stephanie, the same goes for her. Artists, usually when they are really brilliant, it's the case for Kanye West, Taylor Swift, Billie Eilish. I don't know enough about her personally, but in order to produce the kind of art that she produces, she's kind of tormented as well. Even though she looks very happy most of the time, she's a tormented soul in a way. And in order to produce great art, you have to be tormented and to overcome the torment through an aesthetic expression. So yeah, Lady Gaga or Eminem, personally, I appreciate the overwhelming majority of their artistic production, but whoever you are, you have the right, the moral right, not to appreciate their music, but you cannot deny that they are great and that they are profound and that they are universal and that they are you have the right, of course, not to appreciate their artistic expression. That's an opinion that you can have, but they are nonetheless universal and made in the image of God. Yeah. So that's what I had to say. That's my view. That's how I represent this. And yeah, the categories can be partly changed, because socialism is often considered by the socialists to be progressive because it serves an ideal of equality which historically has been achieved in a noble sense in the US, an equality in liberty, an equality between moral, rational agents. It hasn't worked as extensively as it should have maybe, but it has worked nonetheless, and these men are the proof. So socialism can be progressive, libertarianism can be regressive because it's in a caricatural form, it's my property and the exclusion of others, so it can be negative, so they can be partly inverted. Yeah, but this is how I would illustrate that. This is how I represent myself as of now, psychoanalysis. And yeah, now I will comment a few notes that I wrote myself. Yeah. And here I just make a brief remark, because the utility of this document. Economic policies, they are very connected actually with the psychology of the people, and Keynesianism, it's dubious economically first, but it's also dubious psychologically, because Keynesianism is the idea that the state can print or borrow money to invest in the economy, to stimulate growth and employment, to increase the budget, invest in infrastructures, etc. So that's the idea that wealth can be magically created by the state, which creates, how should I explain this? It creates a false, distorted view of economics. First, it destroys capital. Here, I will not make a lecture on economics, but it destroys existing capital because it magically creates money with no backup of savings. It disencourages savings precisely because the people who have money in bank after years or decades of work and saving and thrift, when the state magically print money, the value of the money that they have in bank is being devalued and decreases, and it disincentivizes people to save, and it encourages people to consume, because the purpose is to stimulate the economy by inciting, by encouraging people to consume. So it shortens, no, it increases the time preference. That's an economic concept used by the Austrians, namely, when people have money, how do they use it? Do they use it in the now to consume immediately, to satisfy immediate pleasure to consume goods and services, or do they think forward? Do they accumulate? Do they save, either in buying precious metals or leaving the money in the bank or under the mattress, in order for future consumption, which enables the accumulation of capital for individuals and therefore for entrepreneurs who can borrow these accumulated savings, etc. So it's a Keynesian policy is a high time preference, namely it focuses in the short term, and it has civilizational consequences which are negative because it reduces the time span of the people within a society, because the state prints money out of thin air, I might say, and encourages people to consume in the here and now and not to think in the long term. It's disincentivized to save, to accumulate, to think forward, to plan for the future, etc. So it can, a change of economic policy, a change of interest rates, lower interest rate will give an incentive for people to take debt, to get into debt, to borrow money, to finance projects, etc., etc. So to consume before having saved. So it changes the psychological structure of the people. And this is one of the reasons why there is so much cultural decadence in the West, because it's partly caused by economic modification in the economic structure. This is what the libertarians, Jeff Deist, Per Byland, Hans Hermann Hoppe, and Ron Paul, what they talk about in their books. Yeah, so the economy has an impact upon the psychology, and the statism and socialism, the idea that the state owes to its population free healthcare, free education, infrastructure, job opportunity, employment, security in economics, etc. That the idea that the state is kind of usually it was the symbol of the father who protects the citizen and the country from foreign invasion, but it has become the nanny state, namely the state who has an infinite amount of resources and who feeds the children, which are the citizens, but if the citizens become children, they become immature and they become dependent, and this is what happens with the welfare state. And the libertarians, they advocate private property, responsibility, ethics and morality, because they understand. So the psychological problem of a population, the psychoanalytical conflict, they can be reflected onto the economy and the society at large. And usually the conservative, these are people who think longer term, and the socialists or the leftists, they appeal to people who want to satisfy immediate needs, and they promise free stuff that they borrow, so they put the burden of paying, because what is called free is actually financed by taxes. So they just reject the responsibility on future generation, the tremendous debt accumulated for the welfare state, the retirement pension, for the education, for the failed policies, etc., etc. It's kind of irresponsible. So that's that would be the id aspect, the primitive infantile desires of being pleased in an hedonistic way with no regard for the personal responsibility, thrift, saving, etc., etc. That's the case of the modern West. Yeah. So it's just to illustrate. Yeah. So now I will comment my own notes. And I happen to have received today a book by a cultural Marxist. So that's the culturally Hegelian response to cultural Marxism, this video maybe. Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization. He understood this very well. That's precisely what the Frankfurter school, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, etc., they understood that they had to delegitimize the paternal authority figure, to use the excesses of fascism and German National Socialism, the moral bankruptcy after the loss of the Second World War and the crimes, etc. They delegitimized already before, but they used this to delegitimize the figure of authority, the figure of the father, which has impacted family life, a man and woman relationship, morality, the economy, personal psychological problems, culture, religion, etc., etc. The loosening of sexual morality is simply the emphasis put on hedonism, short-term relationship, hookup culture. Women are free to have sex with whoever they want, but then it is the state, namely the taxpayer, present or future, who has to pay for the single mothers, for the divorce men who are enslaved by having to pay divorce fees because women are free to divorce however they want. They have to finance unemployment for women who are not married but who become economically dependent. So the sexual loosening that the West has experienced since the 1960s is financed by debt and by a complete dissolution of interpersonal relationship, healthy, intelligent, mature relationship. Yeah. So here I comment my own personal case because I can make introspection. I study my own psyche. So I wrote this, I think, before watching the introductory course by Mr. Otto Kernberg. So I wrote about the various countries. For me, the United States of America, from my perspective, they represent individualism in the good sense, maturity, that's a grown-up country, because historically the US, contrary to the Germans, to Germany and Italy and the European monarchies, here the English, they had monarchy, but a parliamentary monarchy, so that would be the transition, and the United States of America, from a European perspective, here European means European of Europe, they represent emancipation from the restrictions of Europe, monarchy, and then collectivism in the 20th century with fascism, National Socialism, etc. That's a country of grown-up who emancipated themselves from the figure of the king already in the 18th century, with the Declaration of Independence and the creation of the United States of America as an institutional country. But the French, they did this as well in the 18th century, and the English, they had done this in the 17th century, but the French, they replaced the king by a socialist bureaucracy, whereas the US, they replaced the king, the English king, by individualistic, self-organizing communities of free citizens, at least all along the 19th century, and up until, in my view, it has to be checked, but I know it's partly true, until the early 20th century, when really here they became so successful. That's my interpretation. I'm not sure that empirical Americans with the culture would agree about the history of their country, but the Americans, they were so successful that they became wealthy, that these are the roaring 20s, in the 1920s of the 20th century. And then Roosevelt, I don't put the blame on Roosevelt, but symbolically that's when the United States, which was an individual country, became really kind of on the path towards collectivism. Already there was the Fed, the creation of the Federal Reserve, and the progressive income tax, I think in 1913. So they came to, they went together in a way. But up until the early decades of the 20th century, the US represented, and for me they still represent, an ideal of a mature, grown-up country, psychological health, balance, liberty, etc., etc. Yeah, I wrote also, over the past few decades, modern degeneracy as well. England, they represent sexual repression, the repression of the primitive primordial instincts, the classical English Puritans, of which most of the pilgrims and the founders, or the classical American stock, was derived in a way. France and Italy and Southern European countries, they represent hedonism. Germany, they represent rigor, authority, repression, virtue, and the strict father figure, whereas whether it's the Austrian Chancellor or Bismarck or Hegel, for me that's the authoritarian father, authoritarian in terms of morality but intellect as well. That's my view for me Hegel is my father, in the sense that the father figure. These are my problems, but yeah. And what I call Europe, not the continent, but Europe as an idea, is the idea of romance, love, tenderness, sweetness, kindness, etc., etc., which is kind of torn between all the various tendencies. Yeah. I wrote about socialism and capitalism. Socialism represents for me infantile, regressive, immature tendencies, whereas capitalism represents repressed but mastered tendencies. Yeah. I wrote, cultural Marxism is an attack, and has been an attack on the sexual morality of Westerners, especially Americans, but eventually all Westerners. Sexual repression is what enables civilization, because precisely civilization can occur when people restrain, limit their primordial impulses in terms of libido and aggression, when they civilize themselves. Here, civilized is not opposed to barbarians, because the barbarians, at least the Germans, they were highly moral. Tacitus wrote a book about Germania, the non-civilized, in a sense of non-economically developed Germanic tribes, before the conquest of Charlemagne, one might say, before partly the Roman conquest, but especially Charlemagne. They were highly moral, virtuous, and religious, but they were not economically developed. Yeah. So the barbarians, from the Greek or Roman perspective, they were not degenerates. They were not economically developed, but they were not morally decadent, most of them. Actually, that's true of the savages of a lot of American countries or American peoples. When the explorer, the conquistador discovered them, a lot of these people, they were barbarians in a sense of not civilized, although there were great civilization as well, but they were not degenerates either. Some maybe, but most of them not. Because precisely in order to sustain itself, a people, a tribe, a culture, a nation, not in a sense of nation state, but a group of people who share common features, they have to repress their primordial instincts, and they have to develop a set of morality. So they were kind of primitive in a sense of they had, a lot of tribes had no legislative, written, explicit, objective code of ethics, but they were nonetheless virtuous. This is the myth of the noble savage, which is partly a myth but partly not. This is what has appealed so much to many European thinkers, Montaigne, Rousseau and others. The moral purity of the savage, and here it's not derogatory because it's a classic in the European tradition. Europeans already since Herodotus and the Romans, the moralists, at every encounter with an other group of humans, really other in terms of radical cultural or ethnic differences, there have been moralists who complain about the decadence of their own civilization and who idealize, in a sense of have a positive image of the other who represents the barbarian who has not yet been corrupted by the decadence of civilization. So it's a classic in Western tradition. Yeah. So yeah, sexual repression is what enables civilization, and also the restraint of aggressive tendencies, and sexual loosening brings forth cultural degeneracy, and also debt in terms of economics, immaturity, childlike behavior, and a high time preference. So economics and finance is connected partly to psychology. Here I made a remark. I will not praise the French a lot necessarily. I haven't up until this moment, but I have to give credit where it's due. The Anglo-Saxons, I've noticed on the internet, they talk a lot about sex, whereas the French, well, they do it as well as like other humans, but they do it less so. So in a way, the French, in my view, they are kind of more hedonistic, and the Anglo-Saxons, it includes classical white Americans, they are more puritanical in a good sense. That's a praise. But actually, Nietzsche, you would probably say, the fact that the Anglo-Saxons talk a lot about sex, more so than the more sexually loosened nations of Southern Europe, like the French partly and the Italian, the Spaniards, etc. Maybe it's a proof that they might not be as pure as they seem. I don't know, but it's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek criticism. It's not a criticism, it's tongue-in-cheek remark about the Anglo-Saxon. They really talk a lot about sex. So in a way, it's because it's kind of taboo, even though in modernity it's not really taboo, but there's still the taboo of past centuries and of classical Puritan culture. And here that's really Puritan. For a lot of French people, puritanical is derogatory. For me, that's a praise. But I can nonetheless, I can't help but notice that it's good to repress the tendencies, but the tendency exists nonetheless. Yeah, that's... yeah. Also, here about my personal story, really as an individual, my high school girlfriend, I knew this and I learned this by watching the lecture. I experienced, because I had a profound romantic attachment and love for her, and there was also the fear of sexual disappointment, that I might disappoint my partner that I loved sexually, the fear of being rejected by the ideal object in a way, the fear of impotence. That's a psychoanalytical problem, but I suffered from this because I was afraid of being a disappointment, and also the idea of the guilt of sexual sin, because when you really love a girlfriend romantically, there is, I know that it's partly psychoanalytical, there is an aspect which envisions that you have so much attachment, a romantic attachment for the loved object, the girlfriend, that the idea of having sex is kind of, it induces guilt, and this is what happened to me on a personal level, because there's the idea that that's a sin against the purity of the love that you have for the person. And I suffered from limerence, which is obsessive romantic attachment. And I know, I've understood this while studying a little bit of psychoanalysis. For some people, when they really fall deeply in love with a girl, usually during teenage years, they can project unconsciously, precisely, onto the girlfriend, the idealization of the mother, because psychoanalysis talks about relationship with the parents in infantile childhood years, and sexual, that's a classic of psychoanalysis, sexual attraction for the mother as a child is a moral taboo. So there is love, usually there is love for the mother, but with forbidden sexual attachment. So it's possible to project onto a girlfriend later in teenage years a deep and profound love for the girlfriend, but who is unconsciously the image of the idealized mother. And that's why it can be thought of to be as some sort of a kind of a sin to have sex with the loved girlfriend, because it's kind of in a way degrading, yeah. And also, so there is the girlfriend, the mother, and the wife. I've already talked about Stella in some of my videos. I already understood, but it's becoming more clear. Stella represents the ideal wife, which is the object of desire and of love as well, but we also with the sex drive and with less feelings of guilt for being sexually attracted. So in a way that's maybe a more mature form of love, where there is partly emotional attachment, but also a non-shameful sexual desire in a way. So that's the wife is the ideal of the girlfriend that one is supposed to love romantically, but with not the idea of sin if there is sexual attraction. That's how I envision this. Also, I wrote about a constant struggle against repressed instincts like aggression, lust, dominance, masculinity, and racism in the case of the modern West. These masculine instincts have been repressed for decades by a leftist superego, political correctness. That's repression of Western masculinity, because the archetype of the Western male was defeated militarily and morally after the Second World War. The excesses of the Germans brought about the image of the Western man, embodied negatively in the perspective of the modern world by Hitler, Mussolini, into disrepute. The classical father, Mussolini, I'm not sure if it was a classical father, but Hitler kind of embodied and represented father figure for the German people, one might say, and he was morally defeated, and therefore the figure of masculine authority was discredited, and still is in the Western world. And there has been a constant struggle against some sort of natural instincts of aggression and lust, but especially all the expressions, the manifestations of masculine assertion, like dominance, aggressivity, masculinity, have been repressed, and this brings about a lot of frustration for Western males. Yeah. And I wrote, modern libertarianism is, in my view, that's a way to channel, namely to limit, why not, restricting too much the German, or actually the white, but predominantly German will to power. Namely, it's an attempt to invest the sex drive, the kind of the life force, in productive endeavor, which is good, but modern libertarianism represents an attempt to assert Western masculinity in the realm of politics and economics without causing too much harm to others, without returning to what is now considered primitive modes of political expression of the Western will to power, the excesses of nationalism. So modern libertarianism, this is what it represents politically, because there is an inner need and will to expand. That's what masculinity means, to kind of to expand in a way, and it is morally forbidden in the context of the modern West, because it can be politically dangerous. So modern libertarianism, that's a higher form of expression in me, which enables white people to express their search for dominance, which is the case for every people, but masculine white males who are morally allowed, more or less, to assert themselves in the realm of libertarianism, because it's a universalist ideology, namely it can appeal potentially to anyone with no contradictions, and this is what it represents. Returning to nationalism is morally forbidden and counterproductive, politically and dangerous even, etc. But remaining in this conservative, fake, right-wing, business-minded mentality, it's not possible either for really males who need to assert themselves. So modern right-wing libertarianism is kind of a balance, yeah. Also, so here I'm talking about my personal case. I give my personal view, but I know it can be partly enlightening. Yeah, because modern libertarians, this is a way for Western men to assert their masculinity without being shunned by the moral community, without being accused of being a dangerous nationalist, etc., etc. German metaphysics, for me, embodies or is characterized or represents the rationalization of fear and also an intellectual will to power. That's how I function when I'm kind of under stress or pressure, or when I encounter fear. I rationalize, and I will explain later, that's how the cortex, the rational part of the brain, channels and transforms the primitive instincts of the amygdala or the limbic system, namely the feelings. The cortex is that which turns feelings like anxiety, fear, etc. into a rational, who rationally processes feelings. So yeah, I have this tendency of being hyper-intellectual, first as a response to pressure and fear, and also as an expression of a will to power. Yeah. Kant would represent for me the moral superego, Hegel the achieving superego, plus the authoritarian father, which comes with a constant downgrade, because that's the figure of the really highly demanding father who constantly downgrades whatever the son does. Here I will put a song by Linkin Park, walking in your shoes, I don't know what you're expecting of me, etc., etc. So it's the ideal that I am unconsciously, and then I have consciously tried to imitate. But the counterpart is that I feel constantly being downgraded because the standards are so high. So I am partly resentful against Hegel. I admire Hegel, but sometimes I'm kind of resentful because the standards are kind of too high. So I feel like a failure. So of course I'm a little bit resentful. And Nietzsche, that's Slim Shady in a way, but also a drunken Hegel. When Hegel drinks too much, not literally, but yeah, I understood this many years ago. Nietzsche is kind of a drunken Hegel. Hegel did not drink. I don't drink either, but that's, yeah. Hegel becomes a little bit, not decadent, but he drinks a little bit too much, he lets his moustache grow, and here you have Nietzsche. Eminem Marshall Mathers is very intelligent. He says in one of his songs, Slim Shady is just bleach and a bottle of vodka, hair bleach and a bottle of vodka. Nietzsche is just Hegel with a moustache and a poetic expression in a way. And I wrote, that has been my case, but kind of inferior people who feel inferior, right-wing, predominantly white people who feel inferior or who feel downgraded by the moralistic superego, liberal leftist, precisely the liberal leftist superego, they find in the figure of Nietzsche, that has been my case, so I cannot blame them, but an unconscious expression of their will to power. Nietzsche is in their view the dominant figure, and they are constantly being downgraded by this superego leftist constant downgrade. Oh, that's wrong, that's not acceptable, you're deplorable, etc. And the re-emergence of a figure like Nietzsche is kind of a response to that, an attempt to find value in an idealized intellectual and moral figure. And I wrote about the opposition of body and intellect, or body and mind. I tend to be hyper-intellectual. Maybe it's because I'm partly a sexual failure, I'm aware of that. The concept, the U-P-S, Hegel says this somewhere, but actually it makes sense. The universal apply if we translate U-P-S to the anthropological and physiognomic, morphological structure of the human beings as anthropological beings. The universal, would be the brain. If we apply these categories to the human body, the U would be the brain. The S, the singular, would be reproductive organs and the belly, basically, sex organs and the belly in a way. And the P would be the heart, the emotion, the passion, etc., etc. And I have a tendency to be kind of a little bit puritanical, so to invest a lot in brain activity unconsciously, in a way, in the universal, to try to detach myself from my physiological instincts, in a way. That's how I function. So yeah, I have a hyperactive brain, in a way, which is partly because that's how my brain functions, but also partly because from a sexual standpoint, I have been kind of a failure. So I try to compensate in the intellectual realm. I've understood this many months ago. Yeah. Well, kind of that's not how it is, but it's partly maybe not a revenge, but when you experience yourself, when you believe that you are a sexual failure. Here, that's in my personal story, just for the girlfriend that I loved as a high school teenager. When you experience yourself as being a sexual failure and you are afraid of disappointing your partner that you love dearly, you try unconsciously to compensate in other fields, and that's what I've been doing for many years. So maybe I have invested unconsciously in tremendous intellectual activity and a search for knowledge, an attempt to fix my broken sexual. I mean, it's not broken, but my not very performing. Maybe. Psychoanalysis is partly the realm of embarrassment a little bit, but if you become aware of the embarrassment, it becomes a little bit less embarrassing. Yeah. And now I will briefly comment the introduction to psychoanalysis. Here I make a personal remark. I have been in some of my videos where I talk about psychology. I kind of reveal a lot of embarrassing aspects. This is what Eminem does. It's really when you dearly love. That's what my level of consciousness when I was a teenager. When you really passionately, romantically love a girlfriend, the woman. I was 15, 16 years old, so she was a woman already, but the female significant other, the girlfriend, when you are romantically in love, that's why in a lot of romance there is no sex. First, you think unconsciously that having sex with your love partner is kind of degrading, and if you do, you are afraid of being a disappointment. And here, pornography, it's problematic for many reasons, because it's kind of it's morally degenerate. It fucks up your brain. It's morally wrong. It messes up. It's problematic for many reasons, but one of them, which is not often mentioned, is that it sets standards for sexual performance which are so high. I'm not in a mood to make jokes, but it's kind of disencouraging in a way. And I discovered pornography when I probably was 14 years old. so before having a sexual intercourse, and you are kind of inhibited because I no longer watch porn, and I advise that you should stop watching porn, whoever you are, but usually these are, well, beautiful women, but also beautiful, or at least muscular, dominant males who perform sexually, etc. So it creates some sort of a standard, which is unconsciously you try to replicate the standard. If you have no experience, you try to replicate the standard of pornography with your girlfriend, and you think of yourself as being a failure, because yeah, so it's a little bit embarrassing, but yeah. So, about Introduction to Psychoanalysis, that's a video by Otto Kernberg, available on YouTube. I will not comment, I took notes, but briefly I will comment. He talked about a clinical case of a woman to illustrate the fear of abandonment. A young woman afraid of being abandoned, of not being right for men, of being criticized, and has a problem to enjoy intimate relationships. She had a strict, cold, distant, and critical mother. She wished to depend on somebody. She has a tendency to feel guilty, expect severe and harsh criticism. I wrote, this is the psychology of this is the psychology of the modern left towards white leftists, towards the rest of white society. The white leftists, whether they are males or females, they embody the cold, distant, critical, strict mother, not in terms of economics, but in terms of morality, where they are constantly downgrading and criticizing white people for being racist, colonialist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, not inclusive enough, polluting, being deplorable, etc., etc. The leftist intellectuals, a lot of them are women, but men as well, they constantly downgrade, which creates a sense of guilt, white guilt. That's how it works. So that it's white against white. It's not, but yeah. Also, a second clinical case, the fear of punishment. A young man, excessively friendly, perfectionist, punctual, precise, preoccupied with details, has a problem with authority. He has inhibition and anger regarding authority. Marshall Mathers talks about this in Legacy. Defiant often, etc., etc. The father is strict, domineering, he expects obedience, critical, demanding. I wrote, for me that's Hegel. So the young man seeks to avoid punishment and he becomes kind of submissive because he makes the same demands on himself, so he internalizes the expectations of the father, and therefore he has a problem to assert his autonomy. And that's the conflict between being submissive and being rebellious. Yeah, and I wrote in religious terms, in religious imagery, the rebellion or the revolt of Satan or Lucifer, whatever. That's a view of interpreting this. God, in this sense, would be the strict, domineering father who is very critical, and Lucifer or whatever would be the rebellious son. Yeah. So yeah, fear of abandonment, fear of punishment. So the relationship with the parents, the mother or the father, or both, partly shapes the personality. Fear of castration, that's clinical case 3. A young man, difficulty in relationship with the girlfriend, who embodies the ideal woman. He has an intense romantic relationship. He's anxious. So here that's a clinical case, but I relate like the previous two with this one as well. Anxious, sexual dysfunction, erectile problem with the loved girlfriend. So the Otto Kernberg, he talks about this. That's the clinical case is a man who has no sexual problem with other girlfriends, but the one that he really loves, it brings forth sexual dysfunction and erectile problem. He had a gratifying relationship with the mother, and the ideal mother is transferred to the girlfriend. Unconsciously, that's the mother. a prohibitive attitude towards masturbation. That's the Oedipal constellation, the Oedipus story, because of unconscious infantile sexuality, an attraction towards the mother as a child, which is morally forbidden, and the father represents the rival. So there's a split between love and sexuality. And I wrote, that's my view of love and romanticism. That's what I talked earlier about. I understood this before watching this conference, that in my view, love is kind of detached from sex because there's some sort of a degrading aspect. That's how I envision this. But precisely maybe to grow up consists in finding the wife with whom it's okay to have sex without feeling guilt or yeah, that's precisely, yeah. Also, he talks about the dynamic nature of the mind, the unconscious conflicts within the psyche. This is what Freud talks about, but this is one of the principles of psychoanalysis. Splitting sexual feelings and love, because there are problems of having sex with the person that one loves. Prohibition or fear, distortion or inhibition, defense to avoid conflict, defense mechanism, etc., etc. This is how leftists function. Usually a lot of leftists, I've noticed it because I was a leftist, and I still value some of the great ideas of the left, the noble ideals, not the idea but the ideals. But actually to grow up means to become more of a right-winger, especially in the modern West, because a lot of leftists, not all of them, but a lot of them, they really have psychoanalytical or psychological or sometimes psychiatric problems. These are people who usually come from not broken families, but they have unconscious conflicts that they try to solve by politicizing their own psychological problems. Yeah. So the dynamic unconscious represent the primitive impulses, that would be the id, Slim Shady in a pop culture language. Libido, that would be the life drive, versus aggression, the death drive. Eros and Thanatos, the positive and the negative in a way, in logical category. Or attraction versus repulsion. Love, excitement, eroticism, warmth would be attraction, and rage, envy, hatred, resentment, disgust would be repulsion. So there are these opposition at some moments, depending on the level of maturity, within the human psyche. And there is a struggle in the repressed unconscious, precisely because some primitive instincts, they have to be repressed in order to enable socialized interaction and social life. And it can create discomfort or mental health problems if the psyche is not balanced. If the repression is excessive, or if it's insufficient, or it creates psychological problems. He talks about then the brain and the mind. So there are two big systems in the brain as an organ, the cortex and the limbic system. So the cortex represents reason, the conscious perception. The limbic system activates affects and feelings, and teaches us in a way, or encourages us to seek or to get away from what feels good or bad. I wrote the cortex would be masculine and the limbic system would be feminine in a way. Feelings are signals that things are wrong, and here that's the view of Hegel, but I kind of agree that rationality and reason, it's partly, here the left, I disagree with the psychological motivation of their criticism, but actually they are partly right when they say that rationality is kind of a masculine, for them that's derogatory, for me it's not, but they associate reason, rationality, science with supremacy or masculine or white dominance, because that's the way that historically Western males, intelligent Western males, have found to express their dominance through providing a rational discourse. That's the critique of cultural Marxism, but actually it might be, and it is, the psychological, Nietzsche already knew this, that's the psychological impulse which drives predominantly Western men, actually all great scientists, to express themselves through reason, but it might be, and sometimes it is, the psychological impulse, but it nonetheless, the result, the objective result, is nonetheless valid for all. The psychological motives behind the work of Newton or Galileo or Darwin is kind of irrelevant. The result is universal truth, in a way, if it's correct. And it's valid for all potential rational humans who can use their cortex sufficiently to grasp scientific truth. So yeah. The amygdala, anxiety, rage, fear, is being irradiated to the cortex, which is intelligent and rational, which processes the primitive affects experienced in the amygdala. And the leftists, I knew this, Stefan Molyneux talks about this, and Jared Taylor as well, they suffer from a lack of feeling sometimes in terms of anxiety, rage or fear. They are unable to perceive danger. That's why their views are completely sometimes disconnected from reality, because they have less of an ability to experience some negative emotions. And the counterpart is that sometimes they're overly emotional as well. So yeah. And in order to be healthy, there has to be an equilibrium between affects and cortex, between the balance between the mind and the heart, in a way. The cortex is that which puts into perspective. I said that was the masculine principle, and a lot of women, I do not accuse them individually, but women, they are more sometimes only living in the realm of affects and feelings, and are significantly less rational. It can be empirically noticed in terms of scientific achievements. Even in this day and age where women are encouraged to compete with men, the number of papers, great books, innovations in science, technology, engineering, etc., traditionally masculine endeavors, the number of female contributions of significance are very limited. Charles Murray wrote a book about this. Diversity, about gender, race and class. Where is Charles Murray? Where is the human diversity? Yeah. There's a chapter, there's a part dedicated to the biological foundation of gender differences or sex differences. Yeah. So, when excessive affects, when the affects are excessive, the cortex can't cope with it, which brings about panic or disorganization. So a lot of overly emotional humans, whether they are males or females, usually they fail to put things into perspective, and this is why democracy is kind of a stupid political organization, a stupid political way of organizing a community, because there are a lot of irrational people who cannot, for psychological or anthropological or cultural reasons, who cannot put things into perspective. That's why democracy has been denounced by almost all great philosophers, political thinkers throughout the ages. But the solution is not authoritarianism, that would be regression turning towards the father figure, or in really the authoritarian negative sense, but libertarianism, that's the ideal of a self-organizing community of grown-up, mature, reasonable, rational individuals. The American ideal of classical America, which succeeded and still exists to this day. But that's why that's my ideal, and it's not. It's partly idealistic in the kind of naive sense, but actually it's not, because there is a proof that it has succeeded and that it does still exist, and not only in the US but also partly in Switzerland, and still vaguely in some Anglo-Saxon countries. Yeah. Okay. Then about the structural development of the mind, he talks about the development of the mind of the child. When the baby is born, he experiences fear, panic, rage, anxiety, because a newly born baby is thrown into the world. Heidegger talks about this. He doesn't talk about this from a demographic standpoint, one might say, from a medical standpoint, but from the fact that man is thrown into the world as a Dasein, you would say, that man is thrown into the world. I think Heidegger writes this somewhere. So he experiences the newly born baby, but the human condition as well, to experience fear, panic, anxiety, rage sometimes. The baby who is just born experiences hunger, he's in need of nourishment, and the mother is the human, usually, who comes to breastfeed the baby, and who relieves the frustration and makes the baby feel good. And the baby, the newly born baby, usually is frustrated if the mother is not here. And to grow up means to be able to deal with the frustration and to delay the gratification, namely to be able to exert a delay of gratification. This is what Stefan Molyneux talks about in a lot of his videos, but actually that's the libertarian view. And to be able to be patient, in a way, that's part of what growing up means, to understand that not everything can be had immediately, to be able to delay precisely in a longer time perspective. And here, leftists in the West, they have a tendency to seek instant gratification, and that's partly an infantile behavior. And they, in the mind of immature leftists, the right-wingers, they represent the father who wants to deprive them from the enjoyment. That's really some primitive thinking. It's not the case of all leftists. They are really highly intelligent and mature leftists, and in this sense, America also, not only America, but America used to produce healthy leftist intellectuals, in a sense. Jefferson was a leftist of his day, in a way. Here it's not really accurate, because the categories, the historical process moves so much over the decades and the century that it cannot be. Here, no, the categories are not correct, but a lot of great men of the past 300 years, they were in their days leftist, and today they would be on the right, if not the far right. And Jefferson and the Republicans, I'm not talking about the American Republicans, but Republican here is a category of the 18th century, the thinkers who believed in limiting the power of the kings without falling prey to the excesses of potential mob rule, namely democracy. So the people who believed in the public organization of life, which requires virtue on the part of the citizens. In this sense, Montesquieu was a Republican, in this very broad sense, namely against authoritarianism and divine rule of king without democracy, the intermediary, the kind of aristocratic Republican ideal. That's the ideal of Jefferson. And in this sense, if this is considered to be leftist as opposed to the traditionalist right-wing views of really 2 or 3 centuries ago, then a lot of leftists are indeed mature and grown-ups and psychologically balanced. Montesquieu, Locke, Stuart Mill, the great liberalism, the classical liberal ideal, is leftist in the perspective of the unfolding of political ideas. Classical liberalism is originally, and has been for a long time, a leftist ideology, as opposed to the really reactionary right of the 18th or 19th century, but they represent a form of mature, intelligent, responsible kind of leftism. And the classical liberal, the ideal of the classical liberal of 2 or 3 centuries ago, in today's world, they are put on the far right in the modern West. Those who have kept the torch of liberty and individual rights, which it means, if it is serious, it means private property. Those who have kept the torch, people like Ron Paul and the libertarians, in today's world, they are considered to be on the far right, but they are not because they are not on the far right ideologically because they are extremists, but simply because the current system, in a way, and the ideological mindset, it has gone so far on the left that just being a classical liberal makes you kind of a radical right-winger. Yeah. So yeah, to grow up, to mature means be able to integrate moments of frustration. They become less frequent, they have less of an impact, to accept that sometimes difficulty is part of life. Yeah, and the cortex is the part of the brain which integrates good and bad experiences to help the individual mature and grow. And to have a normal ego identity is to be able to be one and the same person always, when I say at all times. And traumatic experiences, they tend to cause a split in the personality. And here that's let us take the example of Eminem, Marshall Mathers, Eminem and Slim Shady. I know that Eminem has suffered a lot of many problems, personal, relation problems, etc. over the years, especially in the early 2000s. I don't know, as I record this, I don't know much about his personal biography over the past 10 years, but I guess he has grown up and matured, and I know because he has healed a lot of his wounds over the years, and this consists in becoming one and the same. The splitting in Slim Shady, Eminem, Marshall Mathers, etc., which characterized his artistic expression, especially at the beginning of his career, where it was really spontaneous, you know, because at some moment he had the tendency to play the role of Slim Shady, which can be funny as well, but sometimes it's just the artistic expression of a deep wound or deep suffering. But to heal and to become psychologically integrated means to be able to retain all the aspects of the personality in their multiplicity, but with no excess, without a permanent split. And yeah, and a traumatic experience, that's what the psychoanalyst says, tends to create a division between an idealized world versus a persecutory world, because the trauma experience makes you envision the world as being persecutory, a realm of negative experiences, and you build an idealized world which is distinct from this world. And this is a lot of what the religion envision as the afterlife, or they envision very different. Here that's a Nietzschean analysis of Christianity, but it's partly true of other religions. Traumatic experiences in this life can drive people unconsciously to imagine another world. This is the Nietzschean critique of Platonism and Christian philosophy, in a way. Yeah, and what happened to me as a singular individual, I already told this story many times, but here I'll just give an anecdote. I experienced what has brought forth and driven and put my intellectual development into motion was a terror attack in 2016, which really shook me deeply, one might say. And I unconsciously, I tried to rationalize, and actually I hyper-rationalized, and I built, many years later, unconsciously, but then consciously, an entire philosophical system. But the first impulse, and there has been other traumatic experience later, but every time I react to trauma by rationalizing. Yeah. Then, about the various personality problems, there is the borderline personality problem, when mood shifts are kind of chaotic, they switch from wonderful to bad. Eminem talks about this in some of his songs as well. When it's good, it's great, when it's bad, it's awful, etc. It can be chaotic sometimes for borderline personality disorder. The paranoid personality, he experiences the world as being traumatic, so he's always on alert, suspicious, how to deal with all potential enemies, because the world is a realm of constant potential threat, so one becomes paranoid because there's an attempt to find stability in a potentially threatening world. So there's the temptation to take refuge in an idealized version of oneself, and here I wrote about religious and political history. That's the history of the Jews, who have been living as a tiny minority in sometimes hostile societies. The reason of their hostility, the mutual hostility, lots of books have been written about this. Kevin MacDonald wrote books about this. So the Jews have developed over the centuries a tendency to be hyper alert and suspicious because they have had to live historically in hostile societies, and the Germans as well, for different reasons, not living as tiny minorities as a diaspora in other society, but they live in the middle of Europe, and they have the French on the west, the Italians, sometimes the Austrians on the south, the Poles on the east, the Anglo-Saxon, the English as competitors. This is more recent, but as competitors for dominance, economic, on the sea, etc. So the Germans, plus the inner conflict historically of the Germans, but the Germans, they are also partly paranoid for geographical and geopolitical reasons, because they live in the middle of Europe and they are confronted by hostile forces, the French, the Poles, the Austrians, sometimes the Italians, the Anglo-Saxon, the English, etc., the Russians. So this is what has developed paranoia in some Germans for political reasons. So yeah, a lot of light can be shed on the history, the geopolitical history of Europe over the past centuries by considering a psychoanalytical view. It's not the only factor, but the German of the past century, they were paranoid, but there were partly reasons to be, because there was hostility, economic competition with the English, political competition with the French, ideological competition later with the communists of Russia, etc., etc. Yeah. And also, there's for people who experience a negative experience of the world, there's a temptation to take refuge in an idealized version of oneself. This is what explains, from a psychoanalytical standpoint, why the Jews have maintained their belief in being the chosen people, and why the Germans, or in the last century, or even before, Fichte in the 19th century, had a grandiose view of the German people. Because the German people had suffered and still suffer a lot of being in a hostile environment, and the grandiose view of the Germans that the nationalists of the 20th century had is partly can be explained by an attempt to find refuge in in a difficult world. Yeah, so it brings excesses, a sense of grandeur, which is not always justified, but yeah. About the narcissistic personality, here again, the pathological grandiose self. I could repeat what I've said about paranoid personality. There is the obsessive personality. Here, romanticism can be a little bit pathological sometimes. The depressive personality, it affects predominantly leftists, but sometimes there are depressive personality in right-wing circles with the cynical right-wingers. antisocial behavior and disorder when basic needs are being frustrated by the environment, or lack of sufficient good persons, or too negative an environment. It can create a totally negative view of the world that one is trying to ward off. This might be the origin of Gnosticism among leftists or sometimes right-winger. And the frustration of basic needs by the environment, the left, they tend to believe unconsciously that the environment spontaneously is generous and provides largely enough resources, so that if they are frustrated in the satisfaction of their need, it's not because of the inherent limitation of the resources offered by nature, but because someone steals the abundance. This is how leftists think. So they put the blame of their own frustration. I understand why they are frustrated, but they put the blame on another. And when it's becoming theorized and politicized, it becomes really bad quality Marxism, which consists in saying the rich steal the money, because they believe unconsciously that there is naturally enough resources. And here it's partly tied with the view of the mother who breastfeeds the child. Really some kind of regressive leftists, they intend to envision that Mother Nature spontaneously produces an abundance of goods and resources, and that if there are frustration, and actually there are, it's not because nature can be indifferent to human needs, and humans have to work and to toil in order to produce goods. They do not envision that this might be the case, so they put the blame of a frustrated needs onto the person that steals in their view the plentiful availability of resources. And in a psychological development, that would be the father who separates the child from the mother. That's why some leftists have a problem with their father, the figure of authority, etc., the patriarchy. But actually they blame this on capitalism, which is a complete misunderstanding, because capitalism historically has been the system which has produced the greatest amount of goods and the greatest amount of wealth. So yeah, the assumption that nature is spontaneously plentiful, and that's really the view of the Garden of Eden. That's really here the psychoanalytical interpretation of the political myth of the radical left. Yeah. Light can be shed on this topic, yeah. And also, yeah, he talks about superego, ego, and id. That's the Freudian view of the structure of the mind. The superego is the system of moral, the ethical structure, the do's and don'ts, partly transmitted through the interaction with the parents. The ego is the self, the conscious, the perception of a historical continuity within the individual, and also the significant other. And the id, that would be the dynamic unconscious, aggressive and sexual impulses. A normal superego enables regulation of relationships and gives depth to our convictions. An excess of superego, however, if the severity of prohibitions is too strong, can be pathological. And here that's white liberals, modern white liberals, and historically there has been a tendency of an excessive pathological superego among a lot of white communities, religious, moral communities. Kevin MacDonald talks about this. I will pick up the book because it's really a great book. Kevin MacDonald, through the lens of evolutionary psychology, he explains the moral, the structure of moral communities within predominantly Western people, with a very strong superego. I'm not sure that he uses the terminology of psychoanalysis, but actually he uses the categories of evolutionary psychology, and it makes a lot of sense. So the modern West suffers from a pathological leftist superego, because the severity of the prohibitions, white people are not morally allowed by white leftist, dominant white leftist intellectuals to express, even in a healthy way, their natural impulses for group belonging, living with others who look like them. That's genetic kinship. Males are not allowed to express their aggressivity, white males. So there are no restrictions on sexuality. And Westerners are morally allowed and sometimes encouraged to behave like sexual degenerates, but they are prohibited from expressing healthy natural tendency, group belonging, which can be excessive as well, as has been shown by example of previous centuries, of course. But the superego has become excessive, which brings about antisocial reaction in behavior on the part of the right, of frustrated white people, usually poor white trash, which brings about the excesses of the far right as a reaction. And a lack of parental structure can bring about antisocial behavior as well. And this is why so many Westerners here, white or non-white, it's a cause of concern for a lot of Muslims in Western Europe and Afro-Americans in the US. They grow up in broken families, broken households, because the welfare state destroys economically the need for a family unit. But the family unit is not just to take care of the economic need of the children, but also their psychological, moral, cultural needs. So the household has been destroyed by the welfare state because the state finances single mothers in a way, and the educational system has been wrecked. Economic policies are being wrecked, which brings about unemployment for young males of any origin, young black males, young white males, young Muslim males, etc., especially in the fragile, here it means usually with lower level of intelligence, fragile communities. I'm becoming politically correct. With people with a lower level of IQ on average, the wrecking, economic destructionism, as Mises would say, brings about unemployment or lack of opportunity because of an excess of regulation in terms of the economy, which brings about celibacy, young males who are unable to secure an income, to build a career, to become responsible. The media, communication and culture is partly a little bit decadent. So young men do not grow up, so they do not become attractive for potential female partners, which destroys the demographic, but also the moral sense and the morality of a society. Yeah. Which the destruction of the family unit, the economic, moral, the economically destroyed and replaced by the welfare state, and morally challenged by cultural Marxism, to simplify, it brings about unbalanced, broken, psychologically broken individuals on the left and the right, which brings then about insane people. Yeah. So that's what I had to share and to say. I don't know how long I've been talking. Okay, it's been almost 2 hours, but that's so good because I intended to make videos no longer than 2 hours. So I will just briefly conclude. I've understood, so my personal experience with psychoanalytical theory, I have watched a few lectures. I knew vaguely because I have a vague culture about philosophy and Freud, the Freudian theory is part of this. I have watched videos by Stefan Molyneux over the years, so basically these are just my views of psychoanalysis. I've never read really thoroughly a book, maybe I will. But that's for the theoretical aspect. Other than that, I've made, and I still do, introspection. And psychoanalysis is partly embarrassing because it talks about sex, embarrassing aspects, the relationship with the parents, yeah, natural impulses, etc., etc. It's partly embarrassing, but in order to solve one's own problem on an individual level and collectively eventually, one has to be willing to investigate, to inquire, and eventually to cure by finding health, which means balance. So I understand a lot of my problems on a personal level, and yeah, I understand how I function a lot because precisely I feel embarrassed by a lot of natural impulses because of my personal history, my other determination. So I try to compensate with a super moralistic, in terms of self-restraint, a very moralistic super ego. I practice minimalism, asceticism, etc. And I know that it's good, but sometimes I have a tendency to be in excess of self-denial for some simple pleasures of life, because I associate pleasure with shame, guilt, and lack of control. So I have a tendency to be very puritanical, sometimes in an excessive sense. So I have learned over the past few months to let go a little bit, namely to be willing to... I do not intend to become a consumerist, materialist in the ordinary sense. I still practice, and I still intend to practice minimalism, asceticism, a simple lifestyle, puritanism in a way, but I've learned to accept more, at least morally, some aspect of the human experience. If the pleasures are properly moderated and limited, if it's the proper balance, if it's not excessive, if it does not become vicious, then most hedonistic tendencies, they are okay. It's okay to enjoy having decent food or decent drinking or having sexual intercourse if all these way of satisfying primitive hedonistic impulses are moderated, and they are, if the person is capable of restricting this. Yeah, but in the modern West, for a lot of people, it's way too excessive. All the addictions, alcohol, sugar, fast food, sexual degeneracy, all sorts of addictions, etc., etc. So, yeah. I could be a great psychologist, but I could be a great psychoanalyst. But I know that it's kind of, here I will end with a good joke, I know it's kind of a fraud, a lot of, it's not Freud, it's fraud. It works only in English. A lot of psychoanalysts, they are kind of crooks, in a way. I don't accuse them personally, but actually it's a cheap way of making a lot of money, because they charge a very high, very expensive fees to their patients, and there are a lot of bullshit jobs who have to go away, and maybe a lot of psychoanalysts. I will not force them out of business. I believe in a free competition on the free market, but I will try to make these kind of jobs useless. Yeah. I'm trying. Here I will end with I have a domineering, critical, very demanding father figure, Hegel. So I try to prove my worth in the eyes of my ideal father by trying to be competent, because I feel worthless because the standards are so high. So I could become maybe a good psychoanalyst if I dedicated myself to this. Stefan Molyneux, he started, I don't know exactly, but he talked about controversial political, economic, sociobiological topics. He has softened up a little bit with the years. I don't blame him. He's free to do whatever he wants. He still produces great content, but he has become more and more of a psychologist, and he's kind of very competent psychologist. He provides not therapy, but lectures for free, or lectures or videos for free. But he can help, and he's very competent as a psychologist. Of course, maybe he lacks a person who wants really an intimate relationship with their therapist. That's a little bit insufficient, maybe, but he can provide very enlightening psychological insights. but I do not intend to become a psychologist. For others, I mean. For myself, I have enough problems to solve for myself, but yeah, that's what I could say. And of course, I am conscious of a lot of determinations of my unconscious, but there are others that I'm not aware of. But it's too easy to reduce political problems to psychoanalytical or psychological ones, but since everything is interconnected, in order to restore order, balance, health, sanity, everywhere, all aspects have to be more or less ordered, and yeah. So that was my contribution. Yeah. I don't know when the video will be published. I will rewatch the video. Yeah. But yeah, Nietzsche is a great therapist. Really, he has helped me a lot, and he still does. Hegel is a little bit rigid psychologically. He lacks a little bit of psychological empathy, one might say. But Nietzsche, he brings balance. Yeah. So yeah, I would conclude by saying that Nietzsche, Kant, and Hegel. This is my view of structure. I mean, the philosophical references, how I envision the structure of my psyche and my mind, maybe in a way. Yeah. And Eminem, I will conclude, because he has helped me a lot to understand myself and to understand psychology. He's really an artistic genius, really, but he's more than that. He's a genius, musical genius, but also psychologically, he's really very brilliant, an exceptional human being, and yeah. So maybe it will help others who appreciate Lady Gaga or Eminem or other artists to understand this. Yeah, that's my contribution to making psychoanalysis great again.